Hey everyone, this is Louis7, and today we're going to check out a starter build for the Blue Line Burglar in the Lord of the Rings Online. Now it is going to be a relatively complicated spec with a lot of systems, and things that you will have to keep track of during combat if you want to play optimally. So we'll hopefully break down some of that as we get started with the build, but you can see what my final build looks like for this character. Again, we're doing a 50 trait point build, which is roughly what you would have at level 70. So let's go ahead and re-specialize and see what we get just for going into the blue line. You actually get two abilities. Both of these play with your gamble theme, so that's of course a big part of the blue line burglar. Gambles, which apply debuffs to your enemy, either in the form of damage, they can heal you, or actually weaken the enemy like a more typical debuff that you would think. There's also still the critical chain abilities like you have with the other specs of burglar, and you have a lot of damage over time. Other things that we'll have to look out for are some utility and self-heals. Anyway, to actually get to the abilities, the first one is called Lucky Strike, and that is activated by Double Edge Strike, so that's going to be the second part of your critical chain. If you get a critical hit, you open up Double Edge Strike, and after using Double Edge Strike, you can use Lucky Strike, and this one applies a red gamble to the target, which is your damaging gamble. It does damage over time, and especially at low levels and honestly even high levels, it is really strong. That's going to be your single strongest thing that you have as your blue line burglar. So that is going to be important, but at low levels, it might be hard to actually use that because by the time you use Double Edge Strike, there's actually a decent chance the enemy's dead anyway, but we'll get more use out of it at higher and even mid levels. Anyway, to get to the next ability, that's another gamble ability, and this is going to be a green gamble, so when you hit the target, you restore morale. It's not the craziest healing, but I should point out that anybody that attacks the target, so if you're in a group, anybody that attacks the target can get some healing out of it. Again, it's not insanely strong though. And this is going to be a basic melee ability that you can use whenever in combat, does not have any crit chain requirements or anything like that. So let's go ahead and spec into this. And in the first row, we have a couple options. The first one's going to be Leaf Walker, which has an interesting effect that you might not know what it is because it sounds weird. When you're in stealth, usually you're out of combat. All your stealth abilities are for out of combat. Even when you use Hide in Plain Sight, the in-combat stealth ability, whenever you get that, that actually makes you go out of combat and you can't even use it in instances anymore. So how do you actually get in stealth in combat? Well, that's going to be largely from redline stuff that you actually get from speccing into the redline. There are some other technical ways you can eventually get into in combat stealth in the blue line, but it's not really going to be a big deal. So that's like a non-factor just to point out. So essentially that's something we don't really need to worry about, the increased stealth speed. And honestly, the stealth level basically has no impact. That said, you may find this differs in PvMP. This is of course a PvE starter build that you might find useful to get you started for PvMP, but then you might want to assess your options differently for PvMP as that impacts you. I know Burglar can be a common choice there, and thought I would mention that there are some traits that seem like they're very oriented to PvMP on the Burglar. Anyway, the next one we have here is going to boost our evade chance. That is going to be a better option than the Leaf Walker trait here, so we'll just end up putting 5 points into that. It's not the most exciting, but it's one of those things that helps the solo survivability of the Blue Line Burglar. Now, in general, I will wait to get to the set bonuses later, but honestly, there are some important ones that we need to get to as context determine that. And one of them here is actually Bob and Weave, the first one. When we evade an attack, wow, very synergistic with the first trait we get a little bit of a heal. Honestly, it's not the strongest heal, but you get that 15-20 morale. That's going to be about 1% morale just for reference for my particular character. And his stats and the such, every 2 seconds for 12 seconds, so a little bit of heal over time. It's honestly not the strongest, but just a little bit that can push you to extra survivability in the blue line. Anyway, to get moving on, in the next row, we have some more exciting stuff that can actually boost our damage, including an active ability that is going to be a part of our critical chain, but unlike Double Edge Strike, it's going to apply a damage over time. That said, the damage over time component of it is not that great, and I know it scales pretty poorly with level. It's relatively decent at low levels, but then at high levels, you'll probably notice the damage that it does is not particularly high. That said, it does tear up and will provide beneficial damage over time, eventually in longer combat. Still, that's going to be worth putting a point in to get the active skill. Then the other trait here just boosts our all-around damage over time, which is quite valuable to us as a blue line burglar. So we'll put 4 points into that, and only 4 points because that unlocks the next row. So in the next row, we have a few options. On the far right here is bob and weave healing, and because the healing of that is not like the most impactful, it's probably not worth putting a lot of points in this just to boost that by up to 50% for 5 trait points. We'd rather something that would just make the enemy die faster, so we don't even need healing in the first place. So this is where we get to an interesting option and a mechanic that I will need to point out. So with your gamble applying skills, those are going to be the things like we got for speccing into the blue line. Hedge your bet is going to be one of those abilities that applies a green gamble. There is also Lucky Strike, which applies the damaging gamble. Now, this trait does not actually impact the damage over time component of your damaging gamble, so it's not going to be worth getting for that DOT. It would be a very strong boost for that dot, but it does not impact it. So while we do use our gamble applying skills a lot, we have a lot more non-gamble applying skills, so it's probably worth looking at something else, such as this other trait that we have in this row, which just raw increases our melee damage, and at the 6th rank will give us melee crit chance, which is of course nice and something burglars love for their crit chain. So at this point, I would go ahead and put 5 points into just the raw melee damage. A reason I don't quite go for the damage over time up here with Honed Wit quite yet. At this low of level, you just kill things with your immediate damage relatively quickly, so you don't really get to fully realize the potential of your damage over time abilities. And again, this impacts everything rather than just the specific damage over time ability, so we like general application stuff like this. So with 5 points in that, we unlock the next row, and here we have a couple choices. One of them is going to be utility ability Double Down. So that is Diversion. This might seem like an odd ability for this trait to affect, but Diversion is the one that you can use to make your enemy face the other way while you are in stealth. That is a great combination to use before you pickpocket them, then backstab them. This will make it apply a debilitating gamble, which is just another name for the blue gamble, which is the one that provides a debuff that weakens the enemy and decreases some of their attributes. It's honestly not the strongest. And it's something if you're running any sort of group content or doing challenging content, soloing challenging content, this can be a great trait to get that effect. But in most cases, I don't really get the benefit of that blue gamble. That said, Double Down does have another effect, which makes Provoke daze the enemy, or at least have a chance to daze the enemy, and that chance is increased when in stealth. Now, Provoke at low levels tends to be really strong and has great one-shot potential from stealth. Typically, Cunning Attack is going to provide you the most value over time, but hey, if you can just one-shot an enemy with Provoke, that is often a good choice to use at those lower levels, like when you'd have around this many trait points. And of course, you also have Surprise Strike, but the reason I tend to use that less frequently is it's a melee range ability, and Provoke is really nice because it's a ranged ability. I also will point out that Surprise Strike nicely was recently, somewhat recently at least in the past couple years, buffed, so it is a bit more competitive nowadays. Anyway, that's a very long-winded way to say this is a trait that you can get if you want the utility out of it, but in my experience, I don't really need that utility when I'm playing my blue line burglar at this point. So I would rather just go with something that would straight up buff my damage. So the other trait in this row is going to be Aggravated Bleeds, which just gives us more bleed pulses. That's going to be very valuable overall, but again, at low levels and short fights that you would have on typical landscape, that's not going to be needed. Again, if you're doing tougher content, doing group content as a blue line burglar, or anything where mobs actually survive a decent amount of time, that is definitely worth getting at this point. But for me, I will go ahead and get 2.5% increased crit chance, so we can just get that right off the bat. And then I will actually get damage over time, just raw 5% more damage over time after that. And then we'll put 2 more points into Aggravated Bleed. Again, you can spend those how you want. It's a matter of what you actually do on your character, what you can get the most benefit from, but you'll level quickly enough that eventually you'll just end up getting all of them anyway. So now at this point, we have to spend 1 more trait point to get to the next row. Again, great time to highlight Double Down if you want that effect, but I'll just go ahead and get me 4% extra damage for these gamble applying skills because I do use them. And the next row has a lot going on for us once again. We can get an active ability that is a part of our crit chain, so it's going to be after Double Edge Strike. it will do a decent bit of damage, but also has a chance to apply a stun and start fellowship maneuver, so it can be useful for that crowd control aspect with the stun. The other trait here is going to be even the odds, and this one, let me get rid of diversion there. That's being a big diversion and distracting me. Anyway, even the odds at rank 5 will give a 100% chance for this effect for double-edged strike to grant you a random buff when used on a target with an active gamble. So you may ask yourself, what is this buff? Well, without a whole bunch of testing, you will have to rely on internet resources such as the LOTRO wiki that I am sharing here to know those effects, and the most important one is going to be the decreased attack duration for us, but there is also one that gives you a little bit. It's not much: physical mastery, critical rating, and the basically useless one's going to be evade rating. So those are the 4 buffs that you can get, and I can confirm that you can stack them and just get this buff as many times. There's no limit to it. You can keep reapplying the same even the odds buff and just stack those a bunch. But it is random, and again requires you to use double-edged strike on an enemy with an active gamble to get that effect. It's going to cost us 5 trait points to get to 100%, and honestly it's not going to be worth spending a trait point at this point just to get 120% increase on that. We do have some other more appealing options, such as just increasing our gamble applying skill damage even from earlier, and exposed throw. So we're going to look at this last trait, and this might seem very familiar because this is, besides the better description that actually tells you the abilities it affects, it is the exact same trait as what we had here. It's kind of crazy the copy and paste here, but honestly, setting that aside, it just increases your gamble applying skill damage once again. So at this point, I will go ahead and put 1 point in exposed throat, and because this effect overall is valuable, it's something you'd realize the potential of over long fights. It has a lot of RNG. It's probably not something that's going to help us too much right now, and now I'd rather just get gamble applying skill damage. Now you may ask which one, and I think the obvious answer is the one up here, so we can have that at a full 5, and then we can start worrying about high roller after that. But first, we have to look at the next row of traits, which is just one trait, and it's called a sure thing. And this is the one that we actually want for harmful gamble damage. This one will increase the damage over time of Lucky Strike. I think at this point it would actually be called Gambler Strike from the set bonus, but that basically lets you use it outside of the crit chain and it just becomes a basic ability. Anyway, with that, this trait will increase the damage over time of that, and it's very valuable because that is, again, one of our strongest abilities and single sources of damage as a blue line burglar. So that is going to be an easy and quick 5 points, and that will unlock the last row where we have a couple more interesting abilities. And the first one is going to be all in. Now there is a lot going on with all in, and as you can probably see, and if you're playing with the blue line burglar, you can see there are a lot of complicated systems and there's just a lot of complexity into mastering the gameplay with it and being as efficient as possible. And all in really contributes to that because it is a short duration buff. It's a 1 minute cooldown, has 15-second effect that really increases your attack speed and really increases your damage. That's going to be the important part of it. You get this huge damage buff for 15 seconds, but after those 15 seconds, you actually get this damage nerf. You get decreased damage and you attack slower after the nerf. So basically the way to use all in is you actually want to go all in. You want to use all of your abilities. Importantly, if you're in a long fight, you want to use all of your damage over time abilities so you get that increased melee damage buff while you apply your DOTs, so the DOTs are stronger for their full duration. And then when you get the expiration part, you want to be careful to not actually overwrite those DOTs that are stronger from when you use them during the buff portion of all in. And you just want to use regular abilities. I mean, they'll be weaker, but you can still use your abilities. Just gotta be careful with managing your dots. That's the most important part of all in. So before we go all in, putting a trait point into this cooldown, because it is still going to be valuable, and even in the long run will just give you more damage even if you don't necessarily utilize it to its fullest potential. It will be helpful, and honestly, compared to what we had earlier, it's one of the more exciting and beneficial traits. But the other one we have to look at here is going to be Sharp Eye, which just gives us a 2.5% mitigation buff when your critical chain is active. So when your crit chain is not active, you don't actually have the mitigation buff. It's going to be up a lot of time in combat. And ultimately, what I would recommend with this trait is put a point in it if you want the survivability. Otherwise, it's not really necessary to waste a trait point on that if you don't need the survivability. Okay, so that one was relatively simple, and with that, we'll just go ahead and put 1 point in all in, and now we either have to look at the red line for the rest of our points or back into the blue line. So just briefly, let's take a dive into the red line, because that's the one that's going to boost our damage. If we wanted more utility and survivability, we could go on the L line, but for the starter build, we'll just go for the more straightforward damage boost. So in the red line, what would we put points in, and how would that compare to spending 1 trait point per trait in the blue line, whereas it costs 2 trait points per trait in the red line? Anyway, so we can get increased critical skill multiplier, so when you crit, you will do more damage. We probably don't want the stealth enhancing stuff because we don't have many traits or abilities like improved feint attack to really get much utilization out of that as a blue line burglar. Could get some utility with stun dust, and we can get increased crit chance. Those would be the main appealing things. And if I actually apply 10 trait points, I know that's 51 trait points, but if I apply 10 trait points, what this would look like for the starter build is essentially you get increased crit damage and crit chance. So taking those out, the other option would be to go ahead and get the double-edged strike benefit from even the odds. That really helps with longer combat, but if you find yourself in short combat, that would probably not be worth getting. In fact, the way I should do this is actually the trait points that you would get first. So high roller would be what we would first put points in if we wanted to continue out the blue line here. And then we would go with even the odds. That's something that's really going to impact you for a longer combat. But if you find yourself in these long combat situations, or just want this because it's an interesting effect, you can of course put 5 points in it. And you saw with the build that I had for this character, I already had 5 full points in that. Again, the main buff that you actually want out of that is the attack duration buff. That one is actually pretty impactful and helpful. So it's not like it's something that's going to be useless completely. It's just 75% of the time you will get a buff that is not quite as helpful. So if we chose to go that route, we would only get some critical multiplier instead of increased crit chance. So I will emphasize, for regular landscape gameplay where you're just doing like quests out in the open world of LOTRO that are relatively easy and you kill mobs pretty quickly, I would not be putting my points into even the odds. That is, again, something I would end up getting at higher level when it starts out valuing some of our other options. But for me, I would put 2 points into Death Strike, and that is where I would end my 50 trait point starter build. Again, with all the flexibility that I have talked about and different things you can pick with the Blue Line Burglar and just all the complexities, again, you can alter this how you wish. It's just a starter build, and you can build from here how you wish as well. That is going to be an inherent complexity with some of these classes and specs where they're really support based and just have a lot of different options and flexibility for how you want to build your character for whatever content you happen to be running. But this is where the 50 trait point starter build will end. So I will go ahead and apply that, and we'll have a whole bunch of changes coming to the skill bar. I've pretty much covered what you could do further in the build, but again, there are some more utility defensive options you have in the blue line that you could finish out with Double Down and Sharp Eye. You could also get 5 points in even the odds, especially for a longer combat. And then otherwise, just continue in the red line with a relatively normal red line build. You might want to be careful about like positional damage, unless you do happen to be behind enemies a lot, then of course that's a valuable trait. And also things that boost your damage from stealth, just because that's not as much of a theme for the blue line Burglar, and you have less options for that. A couple particular abilities to highlight are going to be aim and flashing blades, and of course the trait that boosts aim will be very helpful for you as well. And with our build done, we can go ahead and look at the set bonuses. So the first one, Bob and Weave, we already talked about, but when you evade an attack, you'll get a little bit of a heal over time that can only trigger once every 5 seconds. That can help you survive a little bit as your Blue Line Burglar. The next trait is going to be a part of our crit chain. It's actually an active skill called Blind Bet. This is going to be one of the ones that applies the blue gamble, and that will reduce the offensive capabilities of the enemy. Again, you can use that after double-edged strike in the crit chain. I find myself not really using that too frequently in regular combat, but is a useful debuff if you're running group content or in longer fights. Next up is going to be Reveal Weakness, which just boosts that based on this Blue Line set bonus, so that will increase the Finesse debuff as a Blue Line Burglar. The other benefit of this, though, is you actually get increased mitigations plus 3% for yourself, so a little bit boost to survivability. Next set bonus here is going to be based on your fellowship maneuvers. So first of all, good luck getting in a fellowship, and second of all, good luck actually using fellowship maneuvers and getting one of these effects here. But you do get a little bit of a bonus for your fellowship maneuvers. Next set bonus is going to be the one that changes Lucky Strike to Gambler Strike. So we did briefly touch on this one, but to expand on that a little bit, Lucky Strike used to require you to use Double-Edged Strike, or at least the first part of your critical chain, and then you would be able to use it to apply the red gamble. Now you can just start combat with Gambler Strike. It has no requirements, so it just applies the red gamble to the target now. It also does note in the description that it has a reduced cooldown, so that's going to be a very nice set bonus that will essentially change the way that you play the Burglar, and I think in a positive way. It definitely helps with the damage, especially as a blue line Burglar, just applying that right at the start of the combat, and it does a lot of damage, so you can kill things quickly with that. And then we have the set bonus for another active skill. It's kind of crazy here, but this one is called Cash Out, and this is a little bit weird. So the first one, I have talked a lot about how red gambles are really strong, the damage over time component. Well, you can cash out that with Cash Out. If you have a red gamble, you will get some instant damage. But that is typically going to be a complete waste of effect, because in my testing, Cash Out does very little damage when consuming a red gamble, and you'd rather just let the bleed continue. So when you actually might want to use Cash Out from this is going to be to consume a blue gamble to stun the enemy, and that will actually briefly enter stealth for you. That is the one time you can do that here as a blue line Burglar. And the other one is going to be to consume a green gamble to just apply a heal to yourself. Those are going to be the two big effects that you'd like from Cash Out. Another thing to keep in mind is the perspective that you can use Cash Out, then just apply another gamble. So I haven't gone too much into detail on the gambles, but I guess we can expand on that a little bit. So Gambler Strike is actually kind of difficult to use effectively. You want to use it to you can get up to tier 6, tier 1 through tier 6. It's like rolling a die. You can get it up to a tier 6 bleed. So if you get a high tier bleed, it can actually be bad to use this ability again, because you can get a low tier bleed that does less damage. So if you typically in combat, if you have a high tier bleed, you just want to avoid using Gambler Strike on that same enemy. That's of course one of the big themes of the blue line Burglar. If you have a high tier gamble, say like tier 4 or tier 5, you can actually gamble to try to get a tier 6 bleed, get the highest one. But anyway, setting that aside and the class and spec fantasy aside, that is typically the way that you would optimally play the blue line Burglar. You have to keep track of a lot of things, including the tier that you get from the red gamble here in Gambler Strike. So the whole point here is that you can actually use Cash Out, especially the low tier red gamble on the enemy, and then you can just use Gambler Strike as you would anyway, probably to try to apply a higher tier gamble, and you will kind of get both effects at once. So it is a little bit of a niche use case, but thought I would point that out, and it also gave me an opportunity to talk a little bit more about the gambles and the complexities of the blue line Burglar. And then that sets us up for the last set bonus, which has a lot of effects going for it. At first I thought this said pay to win, but it does say you always play to win. So the very first one is actually going to be for even the odds. It increases the proc potency, so basically the potency of the buffs that you can get. That doesn't really change too much with how I would get this as a trait, but did want to point that out. You'll get a little bit of extra boost to those buffs. The next one's going to be decreasing your blind bet cooldown. Blind Bet, again, is the one that used to have 15-second cooldown and now has a 5-second cooldown that you can use as the second part of your critical chain to apply a blue gamble. It also decreases the cooldown of Cash Out, which I suppose would have had a 40-second cooldown and now has 30-second cooldown. And finally, the last effect is actually going to be an increase in the all-in buff duration. So you'll notice earlier that we looked at all in and it had a 15-second buff for the beneficial part, and now that is a 30-second buff. So it greatly outlasts the bad part of the buff, the debuff that it gives you on expiration. So this just increases its overall effectiveness and duration that you have to go all in. Now, there is another point that I honestly just completely forgot to cover earlier, and I'm reminded as I am staring at the light blue text here, but if you do get a kill while the all-in buff is active, you will not actually get the negative effect or debuff there, just to point out. It's not the most impactful thing, but it can actually be very beneficial, and if you're in group content, that means a strategy that you can use is to try to get a killing blow on an ad. If you're in a fight with multiple enemies, you can actually use all in on like a boss fight, but then try to get the killing blow on the ad, and then you would completely negate the negative effect, just as a strategy tip. As usual, I will direct you to my virtue guide and stat guide for more information on virtue choices and the stats you want for your character, but my blue line burglar virtues would pretty much follow the standard DPS virtues that I would choose for my characters. That means loyalty first, and then wit and valor are the next highest value virtues. Typically, valor provides more overall value, while wit can be more beneficial to level early because the finesse can be nice, but often at high levels you start finding gear with finesse. And then typically confidence and determination are going to provide the lowest value, but again, that can change based on your character stats. Again, if you're looking for defensive options though, fidelity is a great choice, as well as tolerance both boost your tactical mitigation. Then after that, charity could be a decent consideration. I do highlight those a little bit extra in this guide just because I knew Blue Burglar can be great for a solo spec with some of its built-in survivability and utility. And that will be a wrap for this guide on the Blue Line Burglar. As usual, please comment any recommendations you have for classes and specs to check out next. If the starter build for the Blue Line Burglar helped you, please consider liking and subscribing for more, or becoming a channel member to support the content and get access to guides early like this. And thanks for watching, everyone.